Thank you. Thank you. Marvellous, marvellous. So we're doing this little series on priorities. And because we're all trying to work out what's important, aren't we, as we juggle all sorts of different things. And last week I suggested that the most important thing is to keep the most important thing the most important thing. And suggested that last week Jesus told us what our most important thing is. And the most important thing is to seek first, put it first, the kingdom of God and his righteousness. I don't know if you were around in the 80s when they sang this song, "The greatest thing in all my life is loving you." Did you sing that? I know the greatest thing in all my life is loving you. It was a bit soppy, to be honest, but it said something. And then verse 2 was "the greatest thing in all my life," and it was different to the first verse, which always seemed odd to me, because either the greatest thing was the first verse or the second verse, and then they sang a third verse, and that was different again. And you think, well, they can't all be the greatest thing in all my life. But Jesus seems to put three things first. So I'm going to talk about another one today. I talked about seek first the kingdom of God. This one, the difficulty in talking about this one is it makes us feel guilty. And I really don't want to do that. So if you go away feeling guilty, then I've failed and I'm sorry, because I do not want you to feel guilty. I want you to feel inspired. I want you to feel determined. I want you to put in place one or two things that you might want to do differently, but I don't want you to feel guilty. Is that all right? Can I just take that off you before we start? The other thing I don't want you to do is think, oh, they should have heard that. Okay, because often, I don't know, all the time this happens to me. If only someone else was here to hear that, that would have been so good for them. and actually, I think this is for you. Okay, so can we take that on board as well? And so if you could just turn to your, no, don't do that, because I hate it when people do that. But just imagine your neighbour telling you this is for you. So according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it was the Last Supper. Table for 26, please, because we're only using one side. And Jesus shares bread and wine and says, I want to give you something to remember me by. And so whenever you eat the bread, whenever you drink wine, whenever you have Passover, remember me. But in John's gospel, it's not that sort of ritual thing. In John's gospel, in chapter 13, it's a simple meal with his friends before he dies. And Jesus, at this meal, after he shares the meal, he says, I want to give you a new commandment. And everyone leans in to Jesus to find out what this new commandment is. And Jesus says this in John chapter 13, verse 34. He says, a new command I give you. Love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. I don't know whether they cringed and thought, I've no idea if they just, is that it? Or whether their jaws dropped at the wisdom and the import of what Jesus was saying at that moment. I really don't know what their response to that is. Oh, yeah, that again, move on. Or, Jesus, you're deadly serious about this, aren't you? Jesus, this is really important, isn't it? And Jesus says, this is your priority. This is a new commandment I'm giving you. This is top 10 stuff. This is number one. Love one another. This is your new commandment. This is your priority, and this is going to be attractive to everybody. If you live like this, everyone is going to be attracted to you. Everyone is going to see. Everyone is going to notice. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples. This is the thing that is going to mark you out. This is what's going to be distinctive about you. This is the thing that's unique about my followers, that you love one another. This is your priority. This is your discipleship priority. This is your evangelistic priority. This is your life priority. This is it for you. Love one another. And of course, as Jesus says that, he uses, well, he probably speaks in Hebrew, to be honest, but when the gospel writers write it up, they use the word agape. And many of you know that Greek is so much better than English when it comes to love, because it separates all sorts of different forms of love. And this is the word for love that is the godlike love. This is the love that doesn't look for any return. This is the love that's unconditional. This is the love that holds the Trinity together as God is love. Some of you will know that in Greek there's a word for liking a lot. That's Philadelphia. There's a different word for blood is thicker than water type, family love. That's storge. There's another word for love that is making love, and that's eros. That actually doesn't appear in the whole of the New Testament. But this word agape hardly appears anywhere else, because it's the Bible love that doesn't see anything valuable in the thing that it's loving, but loves anyway. Sorry, that was a bad phrase. It sees something valuable in something that really shouldn't be, and loves anyway. God is agape. Agape is the dynamic of the self-giving love that holds the Trinity together. Mutual agape. Mutual agape. Love one another. And this is tricky, isn't it? This is really tricky. Because even in that first group of disciples, even in the 12, there were massive differences. They were all white, they were all male, they were all about the same age, but there were massive differences in that group. You had Levi or Matthew, who was a tax collector, and you had Peter, James, and John, who were fishermen. I only know a couple of professional fishermen, but they don't like tax collectors. And particularly they wouldn't like tax collectors under this system, because they're working for the enemy and they're probably ripping us off to make their own money as well. And Jesus says, love one another. Some of them would have been jealous because Mary Magdalene and the closeness of the relationship that Mary had with Jesus. And Jesus says, love one another. So some of them would have been jealous of Peter, James, and John and the relationship they had with Jesus. Love one another. It's the same word Jesus uses elsewhere for love your enemies, but we won't talk about that now. We'll deal with that another time. Love one another. So what does it mean? How can we do that? What does it look like to love one another? Well, one of the things it looks like is, yeah, you've done that, haven't we? Not judging. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but in the most famous verse in the Bible, which is earlier on in John's Gospel, in John chapter 3, it says this: God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world or to judge the world, but to save the world through him. See, what John does there is makes loving people and judging people opposites. And Jesus says, following me, being a disciple of mine, means loving and not judging. And that's so hard for us, isn't it? It's so hard for us not to judge. You see, it's very easy for me to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, by which I mean we decide what is good and evil for someone else. We take the position of deciding what is right and wrong about someone else's life. So we decide that what you're doing is wrong. I'm deciding, maybe with good evidence, that you're not living up to the standards that I think you should. Maybe I think that you're messing up and you need to change. Maybe you shouldn't be doing that. And the trouble is that attitude is eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's not the tree we're meant to eat from. We're meant to eat from the tree of life. We're meant to eat from the tree of the unconditional love of God. We're meant to feast on the fact that God loves us unconditionally, and therefore we can love each other unconditionally. And we all need a few close friends who will love us enough to help us to get things right. But can I tell you that unless you ask me, and unless I've had half a dozen serious conversations with you over at least a year, and at least 3 of them are in the last month, unless I really know and understand your situation and what you're going through, I'm not going to say that I think what you're doing is wrong. Because disciples of Jesus don't judge. Disciples of Jesus love. Disciples of Jesus agape. Disciples of Jesus love unconditionally. They eat from the tree of life. Disciples of Jesus love. See, the disciple of Jesus' response to you having a hard time, you messing up, you doing things wrong, you making bad decisions, is to love. That's our response, to love. To love. Disciples of Jesus leave the judging and the correcting and the criticism to the Pharisees. Disciples of Jesus love. It means not judging, it means honouring. Honouring is all sorts of things are honouring, aren't they? Like turning up on time to my small group. That's honouring my hosts, isn't it? Or it's my host making allowances for the fact that I didn't turn up in time for my small group because of what I'm going through and the hassles and difficulties of getting here. That's honouring. Paul calls it a debt that we owe. He says, don't owe anyone anything except the debt to love one another. So if God has given us so much that we owe a huge amount, and that we pay off that debt by loving one another, Paul seems to say. It means honouring. And it means support and helping. If we're going to love one another, then somehow we need to support one another and help one another. I don't know if you know someone at the moment who's going through a particularly difficult time. Someone at the moment who's had some particularly bad news. Or just is finding life particularly hard. And there they are. And it's very difficult for them. Maybe it's a tragic death, a sudden bad news. Maybe and around them there's some close family and friends, and they're hurting as well. And then around them there's some extended family and some not quite so close friends, but they're hurting too, because they knew this poor person in the middle of this circle. And outside of them, there's a few other people who are affected by this tragedy, not as much as the person in the middle of the circle, but they're just affected by what's going on just because they happen to know the situation or know the person or know the people involved, or it affects them in some way, and they're hurting as well, but not quite as much as the folk in the middle. And then around them, there's all their friends and folk who just happen to know what's going on. And then around them, there's other people who hear about it. Yeah? So on any particular incident, any particular circumstance, on any particular difficulty, you've got someone who's affected massively, then a few others, then a few others, then a few others, then a few others. Love means support and help. So all the questions that we have, all the doubts that we have, all the fears that we have, all the wondering that we have, all the theological arguments that we have, what we do is we ask outwards. We ask God. We don't want to burden the person in the middle. with my questions, my doubts, my fears, my wonderings, my criticisms. We don't do any of that. We ask outwards. So it's okay for the person in the middle to ask anybody anything. Why did God allow this? What's happening to me? Is this going to be all right? We ask those questions outwards. Do you get this? Those are the things. So if you're in circle 3, you find someone in circle 5 to ask your questions, to share your grief. What we do the other way is to love. Actually, we love always, but particularly inwards. Because there's people in this situation who are hurting more than I am. And I want them to know that they're loved. There's people in this situation who are walking through this at a much more intimate level than I am, so they need to know that they're loved. And so wherever we are, we're loving. We're not criticizing, not judging. When we have honest questions, we're not burdening the person nearer the center of the thing. We're loving. Because followers of Jesus love. Followers of Jesus agape. You don't bother them with your ideas, your questions. You just love. Love means not judging. It means honoring. It means supporting and helping. And it means serving. At the start of this chapter where Jesus gives them the new commandment, chapter 13, there's an amazing story. It says, it was just before Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave his world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray him. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel round his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Jesus takes a bowl and a towel and he washes his disciples' feet. We know that this is the role of the lowest servant in the house. We know this was normally done by the work experience guy. The guy who everyone picks on. He's only been there 2 weeks, and so everyone's taking the mickey out of him. Wash those feet, mate, and if you could go and buy a sky hook for the towel to hang it on, that would be really good. And in this story, John tells us that Jesus shows the full extent of his love by doing that. Paul tells us that Jesus had taken on the form of a servant. Here, Jesus' kingdom manifesto is made manifest. Love is serving. And John is really careful to tell us how Jesus was at that point, the state that Jesus was in at that point. And he tells us deliberately that Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power. Jesus can do anything at this point, according to verse 3. He can command 10 legions of angels to get people's feet clean. He can do some trick involving levitation and mass hypnosis. He can make more wine. He can cause leprosy to break out on anyone he wants to. He can change the shape of someone's face just for fun. And all things are under his power, it says. And Jesus was perfectly secure. Perfectly secure. He knew where he'd come from. He knew he'd come from God, and he was going to God, it says in verse 4. He didn't act out of insecurity here, thinking that he had to go low because that's all he was worth. No, he chose to do it because he was showing the full extent of the love of the Father. So with all that full assurance of his security, with all that power, the most appropriate thing that he can do at that time is to wash the feet of his disciples. That's the best thing he can do with all of that power. That's the best thing he could do, knowing who he was in God and knowing that his future is secure in God. That's the very best thing he can do, is to wash his disciples' feet. Why? Because he's showing them the full extent of the Father's love. And he's about to tell them, love one another. Because that's how people will know that you're my disciples. Love means serving. It means going low. It means blessing others. It means putting ourselves out for the benefit of someone else. Jesus washed his disciples' feet. That's easy to say, isn't it? Jesus washed his disciples' feet. And then we think about it some more, and then we think, Jesus washed Peter's feet. And Peter was about to deny Jesus. Peter was the one who didn't understand what was going on. The one who said, you can't do that to me. And Jesus washes his feet, even though Peter's about to deny him. Jesus washes Peter's feet, tells them to love one another like I've loved you. And then he tells Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. And all the time, Jesus looked at Peter and loved him. Jesus washed he washed Peter's feet. Jesus washed Judas's feet. John is very clear to tell us that Judas had already fallen into the temptation to betray Jesus. And Jesus' response to a guy who he knew had fallen into the temptation to betray him is to wash his feet. I know I have all that power. I know I can blast him out. I know I can outwit him. I know I can expose him. I know I can correct him. I know I can mess up his life. I know I can show him what a fool he's been. I know I can criticize. I know I can make a lesson out of him. I know what I'll do. I'll wash his feet. And so the challenge comes to me. What will I do the next time I hear that someone's fallen into some sort of temptation against me? What will I do the next time I have the opportunity to thwart someone or expose someone or out someone or criticize someone? What will I do the next time that I have the opportunity to blast someone or speak negatively about someone? What will I do the next time I see someone who I think has fallen into the temptation to betray me? Of course, it might have been that Jesus was hoping his kindness would somehow melt Judas's heart. That somehow this kindness to Jesus, this act of demonstration of the love of God to Judas would somehow change Judas. And if Jesus hoped for that, it didn't work. Whether or not it was going to change his heart, whether or not it was going to make a difference to Judas, whether or not he was going to respond to the love that was shown him at that point, Jesus washed Judas's feet. And then they shared bread and wine. And then Judas left. And everyone else in the room thought he was going to pay for the room that they'd hired. Jesus knew. But Jesus washed his feet. Love one another. That's the priority. Mutual agape. That all will know. That all will know. All the Peters, all the Judases. That all will know that you are my disciples. So often we get this so wrong, don't we? So often we think that the things about disciples of Jesus is that we believe the same things. I get involved in quite a lot of interchurch activities in the town, and one of the questions that comes up pretty quickly is what's the basis of our unity? What do we all agree on? Because it's important to agree about what we believe in, the line is. And so there's a discussion that normally follows around whether people believe Jesus was fully God and fully man. We want everyone to believe that the prophetic gifts are for today, or we don't want anyone speaking in tongues, or We only want people who believe in the 5 solas or the doctrines of grace. We only want people who can say the creed. And Jesus says they'll know that you are my followers not by what you believe, but by your love. That's how they'll know. It's not because we believe the right things. It's not because we believe the same things. It's because we love one another. Of course, doctrine matters. Of course, right belief helps. Of course, we want to get it right. But I think Jesus would be appalled at what his followers do to each other. When they write stuff on the internet because they disagree with something someone says. Or in times past, even killed each other for not believing the right thing. There's a vicar in Colchester who really seems to like me. And I like him too. And we talk honestly about stuff that's going on in our own lives and in our churches and the struggles we have and the things that are important to us and the triumphs that there are, and it's great. We try and help each other keep the 3 dials up, the spiritual, mental and physical. We try and help each other do that. And he says, I struggle to believe this, but he says that he disagrees with my theology. I think he just hasn't thought about it. And I tell him that I don't agree with the religion around the Church of England and that I really, really, really struggle with that. But I believe that our love for each other is far more important than agreeing on what we believe. Because that's the sort of love and unity that tells people that we're followers of Jesus. Love one another. Thank you. By this will people know that you are my disciples. Not because you have the same belief system or that you have the same moral understanding. It's not people I agree with, nor is it people I approve of. That's not where we get our unity either. We get our unity by self-giving love. I don't know if I should say this, because sometimes it's easier to do something and ask for forgiveness afterwards, isn't it? So I will. So if you could turn the stream off for a minute, that would be helpful. But a few weeks ago, I gave